The Gregathon marches on. VenomousStare is back with another StarCraft 2 commentary featuring your favorite pro gamer as well as mine, IdrA Fields. No one did it better. The bad boy of StarCraft. Absolutely so fun to watch. And we are going to see him play in the GSL, the most prestigious and absolutely fierce Korean tournament in the existence of the game. The tournament with such profound history and longevity that it still goes on today. It's still considered the most prestigious tournament, the one that means the absolute most, the one that if you beat the pro gamer, or if you win, the pro gamers are going to be the ones that are most impressed, your fellow peers. So this just absolutely means so much, and for a non-Korean to be able to go to Korea and qualify in this absolute buzzsaw of a tournament means so much. So if you didn't see the first two games, make sure that you do. It's an absolute must watch. Link will be in the description, and the source file for this video will be in the description as well. So IdrA is going to be facing off against Lotzi Prime. And one little interesting tidbit about this game is that this was sort of the beginning of the game's life, and just to prove to you guys, yes, it is on fucking HD. It's high as quality as it gets. So here's the map pool: IdrA, Veto, Delta Quadrant, and Kulos. Delta Quadrant's a ridiculous rush map. Kulos is insanely bad for Zerg. There's like cliffs everywhere. Scrap Station was good for Zerg because the gold base in the bottom was really difficult for Protoss to deal with, along with the fact that there was no easy third for Protoss, and Desert Oasis just has a really open natural. So the map will be Blistering, Lost Temple, and Metalopolis. And basically this is going to be a somewhat interesting map pool in the sense that Blistering Sands is a pretty claustrophobic, rushy map, but it wasn't as abominable as, say, like a Steps of War. And another interesting thing is Lost Temple is known as sort of a gimmicky map that has a massive high ground cliff over the natural, which was absolutely just a butcher's den against Terran, but against Protoss I think it's merely a disadvantage. And if IdrA can manage to get to the third game here on Metalopolis, that's definitely the macro map, and at this time Artosis even says it in this cast was hailed as the best map at the time. So Metalopolis, certainly the macro map. This is Season 1 of GSL Open Bracket 2010, the first GSL ever. So you can still spawn in close positions, and you can still pylon block or bunker block people's ramps, and they still don't understand how to use the production tab. Blistering Sands had a pretty easy natural to take, and it also had an interesting feature of the main that we saw duplicated a lot in a lot of other like really bad rushy maps, where Blizzard essentially sort of laughed and said, okay Zergs, we hear you're complaining that the maps are too rush centric and it's too hard to take your natural, so what we're going to do is we're going to give backdoor rocks to the main, so if you want to be aggressive you can. And Zerg players sort of sitting there like, well, we would rather just take our natural. And Blizzard was like, well, it's okay, enjoy the rocks. But what this actually equated to was Protoss and Terran players would just put a pylon or a depot at the top of the rocks, and it was just absolutely useless, especially considering that roaches only had 3 range. And even in an era where people were really figuring out macro mechanics and had their head up their ass more often than not, frankly, if you just look at it from the perspective of if you just started watching the game a year ago, it looks like people are really clueless. The game was a lot harder back then in terms of just the macro, but also no one knew what they were doing. And really this backdoor rocks nonsense equated to people in like Platinum League and below just having a bunch of lings run in their base. I didn't really ever see any pro games where it was like, oh, we surprised them with the rocks. The only time the rocks will be used is to be opened up and then maybe to be pressured simultaneously with another attack. Or what you saw sometimes would be Terran or Protoss players would use it against Zerg, even though the rocks were supposed to be good for Zerg, and they would pressure at one side and then threaten them at the other. Force field was incredibly powerful. A big part of why StarCraft 2 was so difficult for Zerg at the beginning of the game was the fact that the Ravager didn't exist. The Ravager gives Zerg a ludicrous amount of potential to defend themselves and not just be railroaded. You might think of the Ravager as a unit where people like build proxy hatches and build 3 Ravagers and then try to break down your front door or your add-on is like a cheesy, stupid unit. In reality, the Ravager was actually just a reprieve from force fields that Zergs had been waiting for 4 years, because force fields would just ruthlessly butcher Zergs. Zergs had no real answer to force fields. Ultras were really bad. Those were the only massive unit they had that could crush them. Zergs would actually sometimes try to actually go roach-burrow, which was terrible and slow, but it was like, look, if you're going to go for a bunch of force fields, I'm going to just try to have to get under them. And because these maps were so cramped and small and congested, it wasn't even really an option to like, oh, there's always this like Protoss and Terran mindset of like, well, this or suggestion, just set up flanks. And on these maps you really couldn't, they were too congested. So what we would see would be a lot of sentry heavy openers, whether they be one base aggressive openers or macro openers. Basically, you could pressure regardless. Even if you were just going for some sort of aggressive play, you could open with a couple sentries in your build and move out with a couple full energy sentries, and it was devastating. And conversely, if you did mix that sentry early on into your build, it was very hard for a Zerg to kill you with the cheese. How is he going to walk up your ramp with banelings if you have a force field? It's just incredibly difficult to cheese a player who opens with a sentry or 2. We see 4 gate expand here for Lotzi, and it looks like he's going to put on some warp gate pressure. It's interesting to note that because the Ravager didn't exist, there was this dichotomy where the force field scaled so hard and was just one of the most ludicrously powerful things in all of StarCraft 2, or really in any RTS, was being able to come at Zergs with force field centric openers on maps like Crossfire and these ridiculous choke pointy maps. And this sort of persisted up into Heart of the Swarm, funnily enough, where the Ravager still didn't exist, and that was actually made worse by the fact that the maps weren't as jokish and bad for Zerg, but what actually happened was the Mothership Core was introduced. So you saw these, like, I'm going to open with like 5 or 6 sentries and do 4 gate pressure builds. Those builds were actually at their most powerful at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm in like 2013, 2014. And Protoss was actually really, really strong around the beginning of HOTS, interestingly enough. But we see here, this is essentially like a Wings of Liberty version of that 4 gate Mothership Core Sentry aggression. I absolutely love to do this to my friend A Ramp on Scrap Station in custom games. Not Scrap Station, Star Station rather. Star Station was a good map of HOTS, and Scrap Station was the map that Lotzi banned. So Lotzi has a pylon up on that Zelnaga tower, and he's going to do some warping in. Remember, it's a 4-second warp in, you didn't need a gate up there. And it looks like he's going to meander onto these rocks and pressure them. So hilariously, the rocks were put in the game as sort of a reprieve for Zerg being cheesed so much, and Zerg just ends up getting abused by the rocks anyway. The roaches were really bad. They had 3 range. It was harder to get up to lair and get your roach speed. They were just really crappy overall. And IdrA starting burrow here, so he might go for the jokish roach-burrow thing. And remember, this is the first thing of GSL. People didn't really understand force field micro until MC won his GSL, the 3rd ever. So 3 force fields get up, and then it's just sort of like throwing darts at a dartboard with your left hand. Now, because it's force fields against roaches that have 3 range, no creep, and just got speed, it's still going to kind of work, but IdrA's going to crush all the sentries, which, if you know anything about these sentry openers, whether it be from 2010, 2011, 2012, you invest so much gas in these sentries. So a lot of times you'll have this big attack where you and Zerg will trade, but if Zerg trades off all of your sentries and you just get lings and roaches, and they're making more lings and roaches, and you're going for your counter push, you're not going to be able to do another sustained force field abuse attack, because each sentry when you warp it in comes warped in with 50 energy, enough for one force field. Thus, even if you blow all your gas, which he could here with 4 geysers going, he could warp in 4 sentries, but he's trying to tech behind with robo, so he's not going to really be able to. But still, hypothetically, you would only be able to have 4 force fields, is the point I'm making. So now, without the sentries, you know that you force your Zerg opponent to make units. You know he's going to attack. Fortunately for IdrA, the creep tumor dies. But Lotzi has to know that IdrA's been pumping units, and without force fields, he's in trouble here. And unfortunately for him, this is how a fight looks when you do not have sentries. And look how insanely small that natural choke is. He could have easily cut IdrA off there with 2 force fields. But unfortunately, he makes a bit of a blunder there. And believe it or not, when Protoss players would make obvious mistakes, Protoss players would make silly decisions like that all the time, and that led to people saying, well, Protoss moves out, and if they make a mistake, they just lose. So that was the genesis of the Mothership Core, this ridiculous god unit that was basically really bad for the game for years. And I know that it looks like the quality has dropped down to scuff 480p. That is just the nature of the VenomousClassic series, in the sense that I cannot improve upon source recordings. A very abusive double robo opener is going to be started here. Attack upgrade going, robo bay going, so we'll see Colossus here very soon. An observer and an immortal are on its way out. And it is going for Bird Roach play. Hopefully for Lotzi, the obs comes out, because if IdrA gets under this army, he could just decimate the army getting under it. But unfortunately for him, the observer comes out. So Lotzi intelligently waited for the observer before moving out. If you don't know, you can actually see if your Zerg opponent gets roach-burrow movement, if they have the little spines on their back. But that was really one of the only ways you could surprise bitch a Protoss player and crush them, was getting burrow without them, burrow movement and burrow and roach speed without them knowing, and burrowing under them and popping up and having a big enough army to kill them. It was sort of a ridiculous gimmicky thing that Zerg had to rely on, but it looks like IdrA's going to counterattack here with a huge roachling swell, as Lotzi was abusively trying to surge into double robo Colossus without any real sentry support, a lot of immortal support without an observer across the map. And IdrA's going to run in here and try to camp the production. He's stomping upon the gateway units. The Colossi goes down, probes are being pulled. Lotzi desperately is trying to stop the flow of units, and the Colossus will retreat here, and it's going to try to hide behind the Immortal, but the Immortal can only do so much, and the Immortal is taken down. IdrA will aggress upon the Colossus and kill it. So if you enjoyed this, make sure you like the video, because even though I can't make the quality of the video better, there's nothing better than IdrA winning, and that concludes that game. So I just want to talk about some of these older players who are in the GSL, if you're wondering, like, oh, who was in the GSL at this time? Here's Tasia, the famous Korean Terran who just crushed foreigners during the summer in 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014. He's against Fruit Dealer, who is an absolute god and the first champion ever. Polt, aka Captain America, which I think is like the shittiest nickname ever. But this was another Korean Terran that just would obliterate foreigners and was an incredibly good player. OGS Top, he was a guy who he like changed his name to like Kawaiian or something. It's not literally Kawaiian, but it's something weird. And he like made the GSL and got raffle stomped. And I think he actually got raffle stomped by Maru. Here we see in the very first GSL ever, the 4th race himself, Maru, playing for Prime, was kicking it around. Zenith, San Zenith, this was a big name, but he really fizzled out. This guy was a Warcraft 3 player, and Inca was a Protoss who made it to the GSL finals against an ST. Went for like DT Rush 3 times and it failed. SKS, he was this like ridiculously cheesy player. Free Saga was another. There were a lot of like these next Free Saga, OGS, Prime guys that were really prominent in the beginning of the game's life but fell off. This Wera clan, I think this is a Warcraft clan. These guys fell off real quick. What I mean by fell off was they qualified for the first couple GSLs when it was an open bracket. No one knew what the hell was going on, but they never won any foreign tournaments. They never did extended damage in the GSL or were around after the first few seasons. Hope Torture made it to the first finals. His name, original ID, was Into the Rainbow. A lot of these guys were like B-teamers on Brood War teams, and what they ended up doing was changing their ID. So like he was Into the Rainbow and Brood War, sort of this like fresh start type thing. Oh, I'll be Hope Torture. Hope Torture notoriously got his ID clowned by Tastosis all the time. Czech Prime was a solid Zerg who tried to banling all in IdrA that IdrA beat. Xenio was this mouthy guy who ended up playing for Team Liquid. Oh, Hong in Prime was like one of the cheesiest Protoss players of all time. Any Pro was famous for doing, basically getting cheesed by Nesty. Nesty did like a spine crawler rush against him on like Test Bug. Bleach. Notice his last name, Beyond. This is the guy who you guys know is the incredible microing player Beyond. He actually played Protoss and went under the name Bleach back then. And hilariously, if you know Rachel Seltzer, the best esports host in the world, the blonde woman, she dates a guy who was a mobile game player, like a quote-unquote pro gamer for a mobile game, and he actually qualified for one of these GSLs, I think it was this one, and lost to Beyond in the first round. He like took a game off of him, but yeah, Rachel Seltzer's boyfriend won a match, or I guess a game in GSL against Beyond when he played Protoss. Isn't that fucking wild? Ensnare was one of these Terran players who seemed like he was so good at the beginning. When Terran got nerfed, he fell off. Same with Hyperdub. These guys filled this first season. Never heard of this guy. Dario Wunsch, TLO. Famously, he would lose this match to Hyperdub, went BBS on him, Barracks Supply Depot, and killed him. This was when TLO still played Terran. Once Zerg got better, he switched to Zerg. The Wind was one of these guys who tried to play Zerg and got cheesed by Terran, I think. So, that's the game. In the next series, or in the next game rather, Game 2, I'm going to talk about the rise of barcodes in StarCraft 2 and how the series affected it.